Salutations friends, Thoth here. Welcome to a new series that I'll be starting up about ancient Greece, specifically classical era Greece. I'll probably be covering Bronze Age Greece and perhaps Greece in the Middle Ages at a later date. This video in particular will be covering Greek government as well as Greek social classes. Perhaps I will be covering Greek childhood as well, though I may put that into a different video. Perhaps when you think of Greek government, you initially think of Athenian democracy, or an image like this with a bunch of old men talking. Or perhaps even that rather loud individual that is so fond of shouting in a leather diaper. Regardless, Greek city-states could be ruled by a huge diversity of governing types. You could have governing bodies of old men, you could have monarchies, you could have oligarchies, democracies. There was a fair bit of diversity in these different governments. There were even sort of amalgamations of, say, monarchy and oligarchy. Classic example of this being ancient Sparta, where they had kings as well as these oligarchs that would be sort of sharing the rule. However, in this video, we're going to be primarily focusing on this sort of big three of Greek government. That is to say, we had autocracies and monarchies and tyrants, we had oligarchies and democracies. We'll be starting with autocracies here, specifically with monarchies and tyrants. Pretty classic example of this would be Agamemnon during the Trojan Wars. On an authoritarian level, he controlled his state, while at the same time he led his armies into combat, making him both general and statesman. Men like this really tended to wield absolute power in ancient times. Sometimes their power would be limited by an sort of oligarchical structure, sort of maybe a council of advisors like we saw with the Roman Senate during the Roman monarchy, or say a council of elders like we saw in Sparta, that could be capable of, say, vetoing a decision made by the king. Though such power among a supporting aristocracy were rare, if not unheard of, and these kings could be elected by said aristocracy, or they could just be part of a hereditary line of rulers. Regardless of how a king was chosen, they were expected to be capable of fighting just like any normal Greek, whether they were a tyrant, someone who generally brutally took power by force and ruled with absolute authority, or just an ordinary monarch. Keep in mind, tyrants weren't necessarily evil, they were just basically kings that took power by force. In summary, regardless of how they were selected, they were generally expected to be warrior kings and to be generals, whether we're talking about the famous Captain Underpants here, or the great King Pyrrhus of Epirus, the only general posited to be greater than or equal to Alexander the Great, and yet to still fail to build an empire because of his inability to actually finish anything that he started. Is truly a definition of a tragic hero. The reason that the warrior king was so desired and so common in Greece was specifically because of the tendency of Greek city-states to train their children in the arts of combat, specifically gymnastics, specifically within gymnastics, boxing, and wrestling. As well, most city-states conscripted people from basically the moment they turned 18. They were taught military arts, they were taught to be warriors. In addition to this, Greeks were expected to continue to engage in gymnastics even after they ceased to be warriors. If you weren't bronze, beautiful, and ripped, you were basically seen as weak and effeminate. You could not at once be both fat and a successful statesman in Greece. If, say, King William the Conqueror had been a Greek king, he would not have been able to end himself rightly by virtue of his own excessive blubber. No, Greek kings had to be made of sterner stuff, otherwise they couldn't get shit done. No one would respect them. Alright, so I think that about covers it, though. As far as Greek autocracy goes, we have tyrants, not necessarily brutal or evil. They simply took power and wielded absolute authority. We had monarchs, occasionally even diarchs, which was basically just two monarchs. And, yeah, they tended to be warriors as well as statesmen. Which brings us now to democracy. Most famous example of this, of course, would be ancient Athens, with the Athenian democracy. As far as I know, that is the first historically documented democracy, although there were many other democracies across Greece. It wasn't just Athens. It's just, it's usually the one everybody hears about because it was so powerful, because it developed its empire and was involved in the Peloponnesian War. And I will be going into more detail with democracy than I did with autocracy, specifically because it is a bit more of a complicated subject. It's not as simple as one person rules and has all the power, or maybe shares it with a few other people. Each democracy tended to do things quite a bit differently. For example, in Athens, they would basically draw straws to see who became the president for that day, or the secretary of state for that day. This, of course, did vary according to which city-state we're talking about, which nation we're talking about, per se. So, let's start getting into some of the details here. Democracy is a word that was derived from the Greek word demos, or people, as well as the Greek word kratos, which meant power. So, with the etymology out of the way, we can get into the actual meat and potatoes of the topic. We'll be starting off with specifically how a democracy worked, which was usually that you had citizens being generally land-owning adult men. By modern standards, this would probably be considered like an oligarchy, but back then this was the standard of democracy as a very limited scope. And like all representative governments or voting governments, these tended to devolve into plutocracies or oligarchies, but we'll get into that later with the iron rule of oligarchy. Just right here, we'll talk about how in democracies, the particularly rich, the particularly socially able, tended to dominate, and they were particularly vulnerable to demagoguery, which is to say people, populist people that are speaking to the people's fears and not to their reason. And this was particularly effective specifically because people aren't really motivated by logic and reason like you probably think. That takes conscious choice, thought, and effort. Now, people tend to be more motivated by their emotions, and they use their logic and reason to back up what they already believe. You see this with Democrats today, you see this with Republicans today. Just about any partisan is going to take evidence that supports their position, even if there's contrary evidence, and they're going to say this undoubtedly proves their position. And the ancient Greeks were no different. And another side note here, the ancient Greeks were also extremely xenophobic. They hated outsiders. It's truly amazing the level of xenophobia that was prevalent within ancient Greece. In order to become a Greek citizen, if you were a foreigner, you had to prove your loyalty unquestionably, which in some sense is a beautiful thing, because you didn't end up with some Greek citizen who was disloyal to his city-state. He always had to love his city-state if he was to become a citizen without reserve. He had to prove it without a doubt. In some senses that's as good. In other senses it makes the voting pool extremely limited, and it also limits the amount of ideas you can squeeze into a voting block. And in some senses this was a sort of good thing. It allowed some more cohesion within the voting blocks. But in other senses, obviously this was extremely limited. You didn't have women voting, which can be good or bad depending on your perspective. You didn't have minorities voting. You only had white men, or not white. You had land-owning men. Predominantly white, of course. This is frickin' Greece we're talking about, but the race didn't really matter to them as much. As far as I know, racial discrimination wasn't really a thing back then. It was more along the lines of, if you're a foreigner, if you're African per se, or you're Middle Eastern, or you're a fucking Chinaman, you prove your loyalty, Ordinarily that meant that in times of war you did something of great valor for the city-state, and that would earn you citizenship. It would allow you to buy land and so on. Outside of war, I'm speaking specifically with Athens, I'm not sure how else you could get a citizenship. Now, obviously, democracy wasn't exactly, it wasn't like some universally loved thing in Greece. Not even within, say, Athens or, the states that actually had democracy. We have a classic example would be Socrates, who expressed doubts regarding democracy, and obviously his doubts came true when he was executed, wrongfully murdered by a public assembly because of, a bunch of slander and lies. Now, we're not entirely certain there's slander and lies, but according to what of his writings we have, of what Plato wrote down about what he said, there's no reason to believe that the charges against him were true. The charges being corrupting the youth and saying the gods were false, that never really what he advocated, and yet he was still sentenced to death by a public assembly. And this brings to light one of the biggest flaws in democracy. If you don't have a voting public that is well educated, and not only well educated, but continually educating themselves about the matters on which they are voting, then you end up with poor decision making and even worse policy making that ultimately can lead to the ruin of your nation state or your city state in the case of Athens. I believe that about covers it for democracy. Alright, it's rule of the many rather than rule of the few. That's the simplest way I can put it. Although Greek democracy was obviously, in modern terms, it'd be probably considered an oligarchy just because of the more stringent measures we have set for democracy, more liberty, I guess, by modern denotations, it is required for democracy to be democracy. And that brings us now to oligarchy, derived from the Greek word oligon, which means few, and archy, which means rule, or like rule of, so it's Greek for rule of the few. This was generally seen as a negative thing by, say, Athenian philosophers. However, at the same time, we can see, Spartan oligarchies. We've seen oligarchies all over the place in Greece. Even Athens was temporarily taken over by oligarchies in, I believe it's 404 BC. Right around that time period, they did have oligarchies take over for very brief periods, ruling councils, just in times of crisis. Sort of like how the Roman Republic had tyrants, not tyrants, how they had dictators that they had take over when they were in times of crisis. We saw this in some of the Punic Wars. But in Greece, as far as oligarchies are concerned, this was more just like, it's basically democracy, but more smaller voting groups. Alright, so the most famous example of this is, of course, ancient Sparta, which had a council of 30 elders, well, technically 28 elders, and then 2 kings, so sort of cooperating kings, sort of akin to Roman consuls, I suppose, but with greatly increased power. And these are generally the legislative body of the Spartan people, although there was a sort of like a kind of public assembly as well that was responsible for more or less just ratifying whatever legislation the Council of Elders decided to put forward. They didn't really have too much power to, say, amend any of the legislation. They just either passed it or didn't. And there was also a group of 5 ephors that was voted for by the Spartan class, I guess sort of like a limited sort of democratic election there. But they were sort of responsible for overseeing the Council of Elders and the Assembly, making sure they didn't get out of hand. In addition to basically policing these legislative bodies, the ephors were also heavily responsible for a lot of judicial duties, specifically in terms of sentencing and punishments. And as a side note, the only reason I'm going into so much depth with Sparta's oligarchy specifically is because it's probably the most archetypical oligarchy as far as the Greeks went, and is probably the one that is best documented, so we're probably going to be able to draw most of our conclusions regarding Greek oligarchy from Sparta. But regardless, as far as Greek oligarchy in general went, it was usually about a council of elders. These were usually rich citizens with a lot of aristocratical power, a lot of influence. These were generally statesmen, and many of them likely were warriors at some point in their lives. However, these weren't a bunch of kings. These were just a simple organization of dictators. And with that, we conclude with oligarchy. And that is the last of our Greek government styles that we'll be covering here. These are, as far as I know, the 3 most predominant. There will be sources in the description for all of the information provided in this video if you want to check them out for yourself. I would also like to encourage you guys to look into a lot of this stuff yourself. Okay, try to look some of this stuff up yourself if you don't believe me, or if you just want to learn something new. As far as Greek government was concerned, it did tend to be very elitist, very aristocratic. They believed that if you were rich, if you were wealthy, if you were a good statesman, then you got to that place by merit, not by just sheer chance. Which really isn't. It's a pretty typical outlook as far as socioeconomic status, or at least the perception of it. This is pretty typical pretty much across medieval, ancient times, Bronze Age, basically every epoch except for modern eras. While there were some philosophers in, say, Athens, and there were philosophers that challenged this concept. However, they weren't generally the commonly held thoughts. You didn't really have too many people like, say, Socrates that just straight up didn't believe in democracy, even if they lived in a democracy. They believed that their system was the right system and that it was the one that was the best. It's simply the way that things were. That was sort of their in-group preference, the way that they were taught to be. Keep in mind, these are generalizations of Greek government, not necessarily true in all cases. I apologize for not being able to get to the social classes and Greek child upbringing as I initially planned to. This video stretched on a bit longer than I had expected it to as far as the governments go, so I suppose I'll be covering Greek social classes in my next video. I'm not entirely certain how I'll be covering Greek childhood and how they covered schooling and the like and how they educated their people. I'll see as far as that goes, and with that, I would like to encourage you to like this video. If you liked it, leave a comment down below. And I have been Thoth. Have a wonderful day.